Well, I'm so excited to now have joining me Sarah Goodyear and Doug Gordon. They're the co-host of The War on Cars and the authors of the new book, Life After Cars: Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile. Sarah, Doug, so great to have you on the podcast.
Wonderful to
Thank you
be here.
so much
Yeah.
for having us. Yeah, really excited to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on the show. I feel like this is a real handshake moment between the climate movement and the movement. I don't know what you call it. The war on cars is such an interesting confrontational phrase, which you guys talk about and laugh about on the podcast. You talk about it in the book as well. And we were talking before I hit record. I think that most people that listen to this show, if they've heard past episodes, we've talked quite a bit about how car culture damages the environment, damages the climate. I think you write in the book that transportation emissions, I think it's like 25% of US emissions come from transportation. I think, and we'll talk about some of the specific environmental harms when it comes to road runoff and tires, which you write about in the book. But I'm very fascinated about this whole idea of car culture and what it is that's preventing us from making change faster. I mean, we've known about induced demand for a century. You look at polling throughout so many parts of the United States, the appetite for transit and more options it's not met with legislation, right? People want more options than they are delivered through public policy. And so I want to take a big step back here and talk about cars and the American dream. How do you think that this whole idea of the automobile kind of became embedded in the American dream starting in the 20th century?
I mean, I think that just we can get into the how in a second, but I think it's really interesting to note just how perfectly automobiles dovetail with a certain kind of American self made myth, which is the rugged individualism, right? Quote unquote. And the idea that everybody is out for themselves and has to take care of themselves and their family, and that the sign of being a good American is being somebody who really takes care of yourself and takes care of your own needs and isn't, expecting the state to do anything for you. Um, the way that cars play into that, of course, is that, yep, you're responsible for getting yourself from point A to point B. You need to do it in a car because you need to be able to take care of yourself. And it's all about you. And I think that the way that that resonates with the larger American, like I said, self mythology of the rugged individual is at the heart of why car culture is so intertwined in our national discourse, our national mindset. And, it's something that has been over decades and generations has been reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. But, the idea that it's about you and not about the community is something that's very perfectly expressed by an automobile, right?
Yeah. And I mean, never mind that underpinning all of that rugged individualism is trillions of dollars in subsidies, fuels dug up from countries far away and our own country, and then processed and refined with additional subsidies and then delivered to pumps with additional subsidies and kept at a low price. Never mind the infrastructure that you drive on is not free and not the result of rugged individualism, but in fact of democratic socialism in its own form. And also, billions of dollars in marketing is spent every year to convince us that the American dream runs directly down a highway or on a traffic-free street through the middle of the city. Watch car commercials as we do every year for the Super Bowl, and patriotism is a big thing that runs deep as a theme through all of those things. I think, to the title of our book, Life After Cars, a point we make in the book is that there is also nobody alive today who knows a life before cars, or really a life with fewer cars, unless you're a little older, let's say, and you grew up in a town before big development hit and everyone bought cars. And so, again, underpinning all of that is just this marketing. Like, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the idea that now we're cooking with gas is not just an organic phrase, right? It's a creation of the gas industry, of the fossil fuel industry, and the idea that we might switch to induction stoves and electric stoves is kind of seen as like, well, it's my right to burn fossil fuels. The same thing is true with automobiles. A lot of the kind of folksy sayings, like America's love affair with the automobile, that's a creation of Madison Avenue as well, as we talk about in the book. That comes from a 1961 infomercial, essentially starring Groucho Marx and sponsored by DuPont, a major fossil fuel and chemical company.
I think it's easy to better understand why cars were so exciting and cool in the 20th century when they were new. And as we talked about with Daniel Knowles, like if you're one of a few people in your neighborhood that has a car, it's amazing, right? Because there's not a lot of congestion. You can get around quickly to different places. As now, so many Americans do have cars, it sucks driving. It sucks driving everywhere, and that's leaving out millions of Americans. I think it's 30. And I think actually I'll have you get the number on this, but there are so many Americans that can't access a car, do not have access to a car, and the way in which we create our cities leaves so many people out. But I'm curious when you look back, because you start your book looking at the 20s and the 30s when cars are being widely adopted. And at the same time, there's enormous pushback. And people are talking about cars in very blunt terms that you would just like not hear in the zeitgeist today. Why do you think cars really took hold over the course of the 20th century and became the dominant form of transportation that our entire cities were built around?
Well, it's capitalism. It's capitalism all the way down in many ways. We talk in the book about the research of Peter Norton, who's a historian at the University of Virginia, and his book Fighting Traffic, which was a big resource for our own, really dives into this period in the 1910s, 1920s through the beginning of the 1930s, where, as you say, cars were beginning to take over, and there was a lot of pushback. At the beginning, cars did have that promise, and they were American ingenuity. And, we've all heard the myths of Henry Ford and the first Model T rolling off the assembly line. But when cars first entered the scene, we describe them in the book as the original move fast and break things, to use a term from Silicon Valley today. They literally moved faster than anything that was on the roads before, anything that had preceded them. And they broke a lot of people. You had thousands upon thousands of people, a death rate of something like 24 to 30 people per 100,000 population in the 1910s and 1920s. You compare that to today, where we see this as a public health crisis, but only 13 people per 100,000 die per population in the United States. And so there was big pushback. And as Norton describes, they would describe drivers as murderers, as death car drivers. The idea that a child might dart out into the street and therefore somehow deserve the fate that came to them when they were run over by a driver, that was not seen as something back then. Kids had a right to the street. There were memorials to the dead that looked like war memorials that you might see from World War I, because indeed the nation had not experienced a level of death and destruction outside of a war, from an invention that was seen as a plaything of the rich at that point. There's this idea that the Model T made the car accessible to the masses, and it did. But for a while, cars were seen as playthings. Like if you lived in the city, you were really only using it to like go to the lake, north of New York City, or go to the Hudson Valley or something like that. So it was just seen as this completely unnecessary plaything that was unleashing all this havoc and destruction everywhere it went. Slowly but surely, automobile manufacturers, the road builders, all the moneyed interests that Peter Norton describes as motordom pushed back and invented things like jaywalking, or in the case of Cincinnati, we talk about in the book, push back on the idea that cars should be speed governed. that they should be kept, under 25 or 20 miles an hour. And so they kept pushing back on this idea of freedom, American freedom, independence, going where you want to on your own speed, your own timetable. And, here we are today, essentially. That's the quick 101.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you need to then go into the post-war period and look at the interstate highway system, and the what that was designed to do was really to create a world in which cities could be just places for people to go and earn some money, and then they could go out to their suburb and live in their suburb and not have to deal with what was going on in the city at all. And indeed, those roads destroyed city after city in the United States of America. And so the interstate highway system was kind of the doubling down on this idea that personal mobility was the way of the future, and that meant that the communal life that we had lived in cities was basically to be abandoned. And there are a lot of obviously racist roots to that, and it played out in a very racist way. And that's the legacy we're dealing with today, because the investment that was made in that infrastructure and in that vision of the United States is still plaguing us now. And it's the reason that a lot of people, when they hear about our book or our ideas, they say, well, okay, maybe that can work somewhere, but not in the United States, because the United States is built for the car. It was built for the car. Like, how are you ever going to change that? And, what we're trying to help people see is that, first of all, the United States wasn't originally built for the car. Even cities that we think of as being newer than those East Coast cities had robust streetcar systems. They had downtowns with thriving businesses. That was true on the West Coast, in the middle of the country, all over the country, right? And so that's, really important that we allow people to not just see that it wasn't always like this, but then to help them imagine that it could once again be different if we want it and we make it happen.
What's one of the interesting things looking at American politics in 2025 is that I think both the right and the left are looking back at aspects of the 20th century and being like, here are the things that we really liked and we want to do again. Here's the things that we really hated. What I think is not at, we're in a time of incredibly heated political division and an incredible amount of social isolation. And I think across the political spectrum, people can agree that those things are problems. Like, we want to lower the temperature in terms of political discourse, and we want to feel more connected to our communities and to our neighbors and to our commonalities as human beings. Cars do a tremendous amount of damage to the social fabric. Writing this book, doing the podcast, what have you learned about the ways in which cars undermine our entire sense of community?
I don't think it's an accident that cities are more progressive places. Now, some of that could be because they're just dense. And if you want to go find a lot of people who are like you, if you're a marginalized person, let's say, and you live in a place where there aren't a lot of people like you, a city's a good place to go. But I also think that because when we live in a city, you are exposed to people who are different than you, whether that's on the subway in New York City or walking around your town. It doesn't have to be Manhattan, right? It can be a small but dense town. You have social interactions where you don't place yourself and your needs above other people. If at least if you're doing it right, I would say, and when I get on the subway and there's every type of person you can imagine on that subway car with me, we are all just people who paid the same amount of money to get where we're going, whether we're white or black, rich or poor, no matter what religion we are, no matter what sexual orientation we are, married, single, old, young, whatever. But in a car, everyone is your enemy. Everyone, the worst thing that can happen to you when you drive to work is everybody else drives to work. But when you ride a bicycle or you walk, one of the best things that can happen to you is if lots of other people walk and bike, because you feel safer, you feel more connected to your community. So, you become faceless and anonymous when you're in a car. I sometimes refer to cars as like the internet comment section of the real world. These aren't real people behind their windshields, they're just in your way. So I think you can't discount the degree to which our political environment is exacerbated by sprawl, by self-enforced segregation, let's say, not to mention the actual segregation from redlining and the white flight that Sarah was describing. Um, but I do think that there is a reason why closer knit communities that have a lot of potential for social interaction beyond transactional ones tend to be more progressive places.
We talk in the book about a classic study that's been replicated many times by the researcher Donald Appleyard. He, in 1969, went around neighborhoods in San Francisco and compared the social lives of people on heavily trafficked streets, medium traffic streets, and low traffic streets. And he found out pretty clearly, and again, this has been replicated in the 21st century in other countries, that people who lived on heavily trafficked streets didn't really know their neighbors. They didn't know the people on the other side of the street, certainly. Whereas on a low traffic street, people felt much more comfortable with their neighbors. They knew what was going on. They didn't just retreat into their homes when they got home, because the street itself was a pleasant place, and a pleasant place for children to be, even. And I think this is another thing that we really try to bring home in the book, is that cars create a really hostile environment for life. They're very hostile for animals, and human beings are animals. And the noise and the dust and the just visceral fear you have when an SUV goes past you at 40 miles an hour, and then that is over and over and over and over again, it does make you retreat from the common spaces of your city. You just want to get home, be inside, be with people because the environment outside is actively hostile and dangerous. And we just accept that because it's constant. We're not even aware. I mean, a lot of people, I was at a beautiful retreat in rural Virginia, and it was so beautiful, so pastoral, rolling farmland and forest. And there was a highway like about a mile and a half from the campus. And because of the way the hillside was configured, you could just hear it all day long and all night long. You could just hear it all the time. And I would say to people, gosh, it's so beautiful here, but the noise from the road is really upsetting me. And they would say, what noise? They couldn't. And then I would point it out to them, and then they would kind of hate me because then they could never unhear it. And that's kind of, that's sort of the cross that you have to bear, so to speak, in this work, is that once you become aware of these things, it's very hard to turn off that awareness. But I think we need that awareness.
Just like personalize this for a minute. I was thinking about, because I'm in Indianapolis. That is a much different transit situation than what you have in New York. And I live in the city, but I live a few miles outside of the downtown. So there's a lot of, and I'm in very much a neighborhood. And I'm looking out at the street right now that I live on. It is a dangerous street. And it is a real like neighborhood street. This is not a road. This is a place where houses were built, where people are meant to walk around, where children are meant to play. But there are a couple of roads nearby that people travel down that are often have a lot of congestion. So what happens? People speed through these neighborhoods because they've got somewhere they need to get to quickly, and there aren't other options. So what do? You speed through the neighborhoods. It makes this street at times very unsafe. And as a result, you don't see kids playing out in these streets. There are kids around here. You don't often see them playing in the streets. You don't often see, especially during like commute times, you don't see people walking around. I also live not too incredibly far from a trail, and from a trail here in Indianapolis is called the Monon Trail,
Mhm.
and it is a cultural icon. People have posters of it in their house. They wear T-shirts of it. It has so much community benefit and joy. And you walk on that trail at any point in time, like during a decent day, there's families out, there are kids playing, it's near parks. It's like incredible real estate because people just have like this emotional attachment. And I look at that, I'm like, how is this not the norm? How is this not everywhere? You can see in which the ways in which people have really strong emotional attachments to cars and to driving, but I don't see any kind of emotional attachment to these public spaces that people seem to enjoy more than anything. And it's more of a statement than a question. I don't know what my question is there, but it's just phenomenal to think about that.
I think people do have an emotional attachment to those places, and I think you would demonstrate that by, like the Monon Trail, for example. I've ridden the Cultural Trail in Indianapolis. Like, if you threaten to rip that out, I bet a lot of people would come out of the woodwork and say, "You can't take that away." Um, and with driving, especially now, especially with like the war on cars, quote unquote, and the livable streets movement that's happening in so many cities, drivers are really, there's a real loss aversion, and so they tend to speak up when you take away so much as one parking space, or say, hey, that busy street, in front of your home, we're going to reduce the speed limit to 20 miles an hour so kids are a little safer. They're like, wait, I'm going to be 10 seconds later to work, right? So they experience at a gut, almost like reptilian level in their brains, where, every day is a battle for survival. And where am I going to store my big metal box if you take away the parking space? But I do think we intuitively understand that car-free spaces are better. The trail is a good example that people flock to it. Well, what if you made it possible for people to walk from your neighborhood to the trail safely, or bike over there, a kid by themselves? We talk in the book about the places people tend to like to go on vacation, whether that's something as commercial as Disneyland or as cultural as Paris. People tend to like to go to car-free spaces. They get it. It's just a question of getting them to see that they could bring those spaces, not Disneyland and not Paris necessarily, but they could bring more walkability and more car-free spaces to where they live to improve their quality of life.
But I mean, I think it's really linked to the grind culture that we have in the United States. So driving is necessary and unpleasant, and but we are completely invested in it because it feeds this perception that, like, yeah, we're working hard, we're yeah, it's going to be unpleasant, the workday is hard, the commute is hard, but that's all this part of grinding and striving, right? And a trail is like, oh, that's like a luxury. That's like a little treat,
It's
right?
recreation.
We can have a little walk for a treat. But like the problem is that that's more necessary than the driving to our happiness and to our ability to see other human beings as human beings. And because we are just so committed to this idea that most of life is going to be a struggle and suffering to get just a little piece of that pie that is actually all in the billionaires freezers right now. But that the idea that pleasant things are necessary and that like the human scale things are necessary is something that I think that we don't even allow ourselves sometimes to think about it, just like we don't allow ourselves to think about the idea that rest is necessary and that it's not a badge of honor to be always like telling everyone how stressed out you are by work or whatever. Like, that's not the way that life should be, right? But that's what we've internalized is the only way to get ahead or even to stop from falling completely off of the cliff of the society that we've built.
I think also, there's this sense that things like bicycles are toys and that cars are for serious people. And it can lead to some really perverse logic where a person driving to a gym is perceived as doing something serious, but a person cycling to work is seen as a child. And that is the result of many factors. Bicycles being marketed that way in the 60s and 70s, for example. Um, but a car is something you have to pay a lot of money for. That you spend a good portion of your working week working to pay for. Whereas anybody can ride a bicycle. A 4-year-old can ride a bicycle. An 80-year-old could ride a bicycle. And so just by its intrinsic nature, it just must be something that's unserious and for unserious people. And there's sort of these liminal qualities where bicycle is for a poor person with no job, or it's for like the rich gentrifier who's invading your neighborhood. So, cars are just like, those are for Americans. Those are for real people with real responsibilities, places to go, old people to drop off at doctor's appointments. And bikes is like a nice little luxury. As Sarah said, like go ride on the trail on the edge of your city.
One of the things that it motivates anyone's politics is how policy impacts children. And I think it's very important. What you write about in the book is just how dangerous cars are to children. So, what did you find writing this book?
We found a lot. I mean, we are both parents and we've both raised children in the city. And we have experience living in places as younger versions of ourselves where you need a car for everyday activities. In the late 1960s, approximately 40 to 50% of kids walked or cycled to school. Now it's down to about 11%. And the interesting thing we found in the book is that it's not actually because children live farther from school. Like the distance kids are living from school hasn't really changed all that much in the last 40 to 50 years. But what has happened, obviously, is that development patterns have changed and there's more car-centric infrastructure. And for example, like the town that I grew up in had a middle school, a junior high school in the middle of town next to City Hall. And there were sidewalks and all kinds of stuff. The high school, which was newer, was built a little farther out in sort of like a greenfield development. And so the only real way for most people to get there was to drive because all the streets around it were dangerous and high speed. And some of them lacked sidewalks. So you're seeing that play out in lots of places. There was another study done by Appleyard's son that looked at kids in two communities. One was high trafficked, where the kids were mostly driven around. The other was slightly low traffic, where kids did most of their trips independently by biking and walking. And what he did was he gave the kids kind of crayons and pencils, and using a technique called cognitive mapping, he asked the kids to draw a map of their neighborhoods and their communities. The kids in the high traffic neighborhood drew very imprecise maps with very few details. It was really just like home, school, and a couple of other places. The kids who lived in the neighborhoods where they could walk and cycle drew incredibly detailed maps, trees, all the different destinations they would go to, friends' homes, parks, more colorful, less indicators of danger. And, so that says something about childhood development. Kids have a right to their communities. And I think we have, look, I'm a member of my local community board. Anyone who's ever gone to a public meeting knows it is rare to find someone under the age of 50 at one of those meetings. 30 is maybe 40 is pushing it. And we have just excluded children from the public planning process and children's needs from the public planning process, but they have as much of a right to the city as anybody else and to their hometowns. We mentioned that 30% stat at the beginning of Americans who can't or don't drive. That includes children. And they have a right to go to the movies, go to a friend's house, go to a park, walk to school independently. And they're capable of doing it, is another thing that we talk about in the book.
And also, automobile crashes are a leading cause of death for children in this country. I think they've been recently surpassed by gun deaths. That's not exactly like good news to write home about. They still kill, I think, about 3 kids every day in the United States under the age of 14 die in car crashes, and countless more are injured. And that's obviously sort of the top line toll. There's also a lot of kids who lose their parents. That happened to some kids in my son's school. Their mother was killed by a driver and she left behind 4 kids. I mean, it was pretty horrible to see. but then also, the health effects of air pollution. Often schools are near big roads. Um, that kind of air pollution causes cognitive delays and developmental delays. That's been proven over and over again. We never think about that when we're citing schools. And then also, like Doug said, the developmental side of it, just in terms of, you often hear, if a kid gets hit by a car, they'll say, well, they darted out into traffic. And, I like to say, like, kids are supposed to dart. Like, that is what kids do. That is a way of moving. That is a learning process for them about how do you move your body around in space. And we've taken that away from them. We've taken out the ability for them to just go out into public space and move around safely in the way that they should as young developing human beings. And that's really tragic. And then we turn around and we say, I don't know why they're on their devices all the time. Why are kids on their devices all the time? Well, because there's no place safe for them to go. And parents know that the street outside is not a safe place to play. And they are, perfectly justified in not letting their kids have that kind of mobility. But what are the what are the options? There are no options. And so everybody gets stuck, in a more sedentary lifestyle. And kids are really robbed of important ways of learning, not just about how to move their bodies, but how to be with other people in social spaces, how to share space with other human beings, all of that stuff. That's the way we developed for millions of years. And for 125 years, it's changed. And then the other cognitive disconnect that happens for parents is parents have to put their kids into this car every day to get them to school or wherever else they're going. And these are parents who would never dream of feeding their kids some food that was unsafe or unhealthy, or they think very carefully about what kind of school their kid is going to, or what kind of influences they're exposed to, in a number of other ways. Keeping them safe is a priority, except for every day they have to do this thing that deep down they know is not really safe, which is to put their kid into a car. And that's an enormous psychic pressure on parents. And for families, all of these autocentric patterns create a lot of stress and tension and conflict, and just the sense of being confined physically. And I think that is just so deeply damaging to us. And it's something that is so pervasive that we literally cannot allow ourselves to think about it, because, I mean, this comes up with climate change all the time, right? Like, it's hard to think about because it seems so pervasive, so much like something you'll never be able to change. And yet, in your deepest self that it's happening, and it creates a lot of psychic strain.
In the book, we talk about a writer, a child psychologist, Louise Bates Ames, who wrote a series of books in the 60s and 70s. And in 1979, they're all about your child at different stages of development, year by year. And in 1979, she wrote a book about 6-year-olds, and sort of marked what are the proper developments for a 6-year-old kid, a neurotypical kid at that age. And it was things like, can they count 10 to 20 pennies? Do they know the days of the week? Things like that. There was that kind of cognitive stuff. There was some physical stuff, like how many baby teeth they'd lost. But one of the metrics was, can he walk to run a short errand 4 to 8 blocks? And what's interesting about that is not just that we say, okay, kids are perfectly capable of running a short errand, like go pick mom up some milk, at the grocery store 6 blocks away. But what's really remarkable about that to me when I read it is just the assumption that parents would let their kid do it. Like, you can't imagine in many newer American suburbs that they would even let a 13 or 14-year-old go do that. But here it wasn't, not that long ago, 1979, it was just assumed that a 6 or 7-year-old kid could have the freedom to, like, take some cash from mom or dad and go to the store by themselves.
Well, and you write about this in the book, and I'll paraphrase. I'm sure I'll get the quote wrong, but it's like it's not how say or how how safe the distance is or the route is, it's how safe the most dangerous part of that route is, right? And I just think about kids going to school, and you have kids quoted in the book that talk about this. Like, if you're not walking to school, not biking to school, you're holding so much unnecessary energy and stress that makes your ability to learn harder. And when we have, we don't have enough movement in this country as a result of a lack of transit options, of a lack of an ability to walk and bike places. And that just puts such a burden on children's ability to learn and get along with each other and to be more social. And it's so damaging, especially when we have all these conversations around education that don't hit on this, because what a unbelievable opportunity to prevent all of the cognitive damage that's happening from the pollution that kids are exposed to, and to actually have these things that allow them to exercise and move their bodies and use energy in ways that are going to make them happier and more productive. And I think honestly, like, cars are not guns. Like, the guns are different than cars in many ways. There's different utilities to cars. And it's not as if, again, it's not a one-to-one example. But I think people like myself who are progressive have a much easier time talking about how harmful guns are than they do talking about how harmful cars are. It's easy to understand why that's the case. Many of us, so many Americans, use cars and feel like they have to use cars, as we talked about. But I just wonder, part of the climate problem is that we have to talk about it very honestly and talk about the damage very honestly, whether it's climate, whether it's air pollution. And I think we have to talk about these things more frankly. I'm like, I know I'm preaching to the choir. Like, you have a podcast with it where you do this every single week. But when you talk to, let's just say, people who wouldn't be an avid listener of the podcast, but would be open to these kinds of conversations, are not rolling coal every weekend. Like, what do you think it would take to have a culture where we talked more honestly about the harms cars are doing or causing?
I mean, I think just being frank is a big part of it. I think you're seeing in Democratic politics today that the elected officials who are being very honest about what's at stake and just speaking frankly are actually quite popular. People don't mind being told the truth so long as they feel like they're being spoken to like adults. And so I think there's that. Obviously, there would be a lot of pushback if, Governor Pritzker or AOC or Gavin Newsom or any Democratic official said, like, well, we're going to like cut car use down by 50% across our state or whatever. But, I think our goal with the book, again, like you said, it's not going to reach the rolling coal folks, but it is to get people to say, hey, like, my town is installing a new bus station or a new bike lane, and I kind of get it now. I may not throw my keys out. I still like driving. I still like my car, but I understand that this is the way the world is going and should go. Because sort of as we've been talking about, people don't see the harms from cars. The gun stuff, it is a interesting comparison. We've made it on the show. We've done an episode about guns versus cars. But of course, the difference is nobody drives a gun to work, right? Like, you don't need that to go get your groceries unless you're a very insecure man in Texas who, wants to open carry at a Target or something. But so that is a real uphill battle that we have of like, people can't imagine another way. And what we're trying to do with the book is to say, we're not talking about tearing every highway down tomorrow and forcing you to scrap your car. What we are saying is that you will be more free if you, or at least your neighbors, have more options. Like, so that one really dangerous street in your neighborhood that prevents people from walking or biking to the trail, you fix that one spot. And suddenly you increase walking and cycling in your town by just a few percentage points, but it makes all the difference in the world. And then it snowballs. That's what we're hoping for.
Yeah, I think you have to be frank about the size of the challenge, and you have to acknowledge people where they are and say, like, I know it's hard to see how this could be any different, and you have to give them examples. But then you do, I think, Doug is talking about fixing a connection between a one trail and another. The idea of repair, and um, I think it's something that people are actually really open to at this point in history. The idea that there's repair to be done and healing to be done and kind of regeneration. Another thing that the climate movement is really, I think, trying to tap into. And I think if you're frank with people and you say, driving really sucks, doesn't it? And everyone will agree. I mean, everyone will say, like, yeah, most of the time I really hate driving, except for, when I go on a road trip or whatever. But just quotidian driving sucks. So you get people to agree with that. And then you say, what if we fixed some of this stuff so you didn't have to drive as much? What if we fixed this street so it was nice to walk down instead of, a hellscape? What if we created a park here or a pedestrian plaza, or made your neighborhood put some sidewalks so that the kids could walk to school? I do think this idea of repair is really powerful, and I think that people can respond to it, because if you say to them, this is broken, we all know that it's broken, we all hate it. And so how can we start making it better again? How can we start fixing it? And you approach people with compassion for their pressures and struggles that they're facing, and say, like, I know this is hard for you. It really sucks. We want to make this better.
Yeah.
I think that helps.
I think a really good comparison, putting aside guns for a moment, is healthcare. Our system of privatized healthcare is terrible. It leaves a lot of people out of it who can't afford it. Even the people who do pay for it and feel like they can afford it don't use it, because using it above and beyond a certain point gets really expensive. You can lose it at any moment if something goes wrong in your life, like losing a job, for example. And so when Obamacare came around, when Obama first took office, there were massive protests, right? Like, get your hands off my healthcare. People really couldn't imagine it. All the gaffes that Obama found himself of, like, if you like your doctor, you can keep it. All of these things that, like, caused a lot of political trouble for him. Flash forward to the first Trump administration and Republicans trying to take away Obamacare. And suddenly people were like, hands off my Obamacare, right? And Obamacare is not perfect by any stretch. I think Sarah and I both agree that, like, Medicare for all would be a better solution. But there's so many similarities, like early in the healthcare advocacy days, it was sort of like your weirdo friends who had lived in Sweden or whatever, who understood that, like, government healthcare was actually better and you could switch jobs more easily. And you didn't go bankrupt if you broke your leg. And then we got little tastes of it with Obamacare, of like, oh, wait, you mean, like, I can't be denied health insurance just because I had diabetes? That's good. And so I think what our movement is following is a similar trajectory of that. Like, we talk about a Harvard researcher, Lant Pritchard, who says, like, all progressive change goes through a number of stages. First, they're seen as silly, then controversial, then progressive, then obvious. And I think we, in our movement, are in somewhere in the controversial to progressive stage of the Safe Streets and alternative transportation mode. In other places, I think it's more obvious, but we're making progress. I think it's no longer seen as silly by most people.
I want to talk about, we talk about often on the shows, the upside and the downside of electric vehicles. If you listen to this podcast, electric vehicles don't have tailpipe emissions compared to internal combustion engines. Not having tailpipe emissions mean we don't have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the same way, at least not coming from the tailpipe. And we don't have the same kind of air pollution. However, another thing we talk about over and over again on this show, we cannot just simply go from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles and have the same amount of vehicles on the road. That causes an unbelievable amount of harm around the globe. Again, not the same kind of harm that internal combustion engines cause, but an amount of harm that is unnecessary. It's also like there are real downsides to electric vehicles when it comes to the weight of electric vehicles. And as my co-host talked to Daniel Knowles about a couple years ago, the fact that the fuel for electric, the fact that electricity is cheaper than fuel, like that's a great marketing pitch. It also is a reason for people to drive more, and that's not good, right? And so we have to be honest about that. But another thing that is so scary, whether it's internal combustion engines or electric vehicles, is what happens with tires. What
Mm.
is happening when the kind of air pollution and contaminants that come from tires? What do we need to know about how crazy unsafe tires are?
Yeah, so this is something that I hadn't really been that up on until we wrote the book. And I interviewed a scientist in Washington state about what they've discovered there, which is that runoff of tire particulate is and associated chemicals, and it's a complicated chemical reaction. Can't really explain it that quickly, but they were causing mass die-offs of coho salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And it took scientists years to figure out what was happening. At first, it was just these salmon were dying in droves. Nobody knew why. And they spent years and years and years doing the research to isolate the 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 particulates that were causing this, and they were coming off of tires. They are coming off of tires, and that's just one of the many toxic things that you find in road runoff. But we don't even know how many other animals this is affecting. Coho salmon are obviously sort of a charismatic species in the Pacific Northwest, very important culturally for the indigenous people there, and to the economy. And so, I think that that was a very visible thing that people could see. But part of what made it so hard for them to figure it out is these formulas for tire composition are proprietary. It reminds me of, I had done some reporting on fracking in the past, and fracking water and fracking, that they don't have to tell you what is in these concoctions that they're pumping into the water table, because it's proprietary. And it's the same thing with the tire compositions. And so even if there's pressure on them to take out the thing that's killing the salmon now, we don't have any way of knowing what they're going to replace that with. And pretty much anything that has ever been put into a tire to make it work the way that it has to work is toxic. And then that just ends up in everything. And we and with electric vehicles having the heavier weights that they do, they that will cause even more tire wear, which over the course of how many miles traveled there are is a significant thing. And I was at an art exhibit recently. There's a famous artist who took a picture of some tire piles in California. These enormous mounds of tires that are six stories high, just going on for as far as you can see. And he created these amazing pictures where you just see the extent of them. So I was at the museum looking at them, and these people next to me were saying, "Oh my God, can you believe how many tires that is?" And they're like, "Well, I guess they have to go somewhere." And then one woman said to the others, she said, "Well, I've heard that they're talking about recycling tires as airplane fuel now." And I just looked at them and I said, "Or we could just drive less and have fewer cars." And we were in this very fancy museum in New York, and I think that they were not happy that I'd spoken to them, but I couldn't resist, because it's like so many things, so many of the problems that we have today, the simplest way to solve them is to use less, right? To burn less fossil fuel, to drive fewer cars, to create other ways of getting around, that would wipe out all of these problems. Instead, we're doing these jumping through hoops, trying to engineer some new way of doing it that's going to just fix everything somehow in one swoop of technology. And that's not how it works. It's much simpler than that. And, you know, Cory Doctorow was on our show. I think it was Cory Doctorow, right, Doug, who said geometry hates cars.
Yes.
And you know, just from a land use perspective, you're never going to get around the fact that an electric car is just as big and needs to go on a road that will take up just as much space and cost just as much money as an internal combustion car. So we need to have fewer cars.
Yeah.
And it's good if they're electric, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, the party line on the podcast is that we must and we really need to electrify everything as quickly as possible. And if you live in a place where you have no alternative but to drive, that car ought to be electric, 100%, with no debate from the War on Cars team. But in places where there are alternatives and could be more, like New York City, like Chicago, like small towns that have walkable main streets, we should be making it possible for people to live car free or car light. And where cars are necessary in such cities like UPS trucks, service vehicles, ambulances, those vehicles, which aren't going anywhere anytime soon, obviously those should be electric. Taxis, ambulances, like I said, delivery trucks, absolutely electrify everything. But we really need to look around the country and say, where can we make it possible for people to get by with, you know, go down from 2 to 1 or from 2 or 1 to 0 cars? Or if they keep those cars, you know, use them a lot less. Because the other thing is the safety hazards don't go away. And those also might be aggravated by electric cars, which often accelerate faster than internal combustion cars. And we sort of joke in the book that, like, if I'm riding my bicycle and I'm hit by an electric vehicle, my dying words are not, well, thank God my death was good for the environment, right? Like, the mass of that car hitting me is going to have the same outcome, whether it's powered by gas, electricity, or magical thinking. And I think to Sarah's anecdote, you know, this idea that, like, oh, I hear they're going to recycle tires and turn it into airplane fuel. It's like, can I give these people a lesson in, like, mass and physics? Because the particulate matter of burning stuff doesn't mean that the mass of that thing goes away. It just gets turned into something that you then breathe in. Like, we would all look at a tire fire in California and say that's an environmental tragedy, but 1,000 airplanes burning the same number of tires just so they could fly, we'd, like, think of as a miracle of aviation. So it does show a sort of magical thinking about how we can continue to go on like this. And we just can't. It's complete. Cars are unsustainable, whether they are robotic, electric, or flying. They are unsustainable.
The reason I love, one of the many reasons I loved this book so much, is that you start talking about the many different ways people can get involved in this movement and this work, and how you can find yourself in this work, despite where you're coming from, what your goals may be. And then you diagnose the problem, you explain the problem, and then you talk about the countless number of solutions and the ways people are approaching this solution all around the country, and how people have done it in other countries over the last century. I mean, Amsterdam hasn't always been Amsterdam, and you talk about that in the book. And, you know, we don't have time to get into all the examples of how people are making change, but just real quickly here, as we wrap up, what are some of the ways you see everyday people going out and making change, figuring out how to make even the smallest contributions in their city to help improve things a little bit?
Let me give one example, and I think, Sarah, you should take the kind of, like, maybe top 3 examples. But the most optimistic and hopeful I got, and the happiest reporting I did for the book, was the bike bus movement that is happening all around the country and around the world. We focus mostly on the bike buses in Montclair, New Jersey, and Portland, Oregon. The bike bus movement in the United States was largely kicked off by a man named Sam Balto in Portland, who had seen video of bike buses in Spain and elsewhere, and he wanted to bring this to the school where he taught. He's a physical education teacher. And it really is just like a bunch of kids wait at various stops around the city with their bicycles, and slowly but surely they form a sort of critical mass and just take over the street. And he'll have hundreds of kids and parent and adult volunteers shepherding these children to school on their bicycles. And these are in neighborhoods that don't really have bike lanes, especially in Montclair, New Jersey, that have a lot of high traffic streets. And it's just showing that like these distances are not that far for these children. There were first graders and kindergartners on the bike bus that I went on, and they were perfectly capable of doing it. They just need a safe space to do it. And that is, to me, the best example of how you don't have to have a subway system and bike lanes. You don't have to be New York City. And you can make a small but really positive change in your community.
Yeah, I mean, this is this sort of big picture example, and it's not an ordinary person, but the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, is somebody who has worked over her entire tenure, which I think is 12 years now almost, to improve that city. And she has done it just very methodically by, saying, I'm going to clean up the Seine. I'm going to clean it, make it clean enough for people to swim in by the time the Olympics comes around. And, and she did those things that were necessary. I'm going to take cars off of the banks of the Seine. And she did that. I'm going to make streets outside of schools, pedestrianized so that children can play in the street outside of their school. And she has just stuck with it. She has shown the political courage that, people complain about her constantly. She gets so much hate because, the French can be very, very good at complaining and very, very good at hating on people. But the reality is that, the air quality in Paris has improved dramatically in the last 5 years, and you can measure it, and that has been, she has done that with the support of people in nonprofits and people in politics and people at the grassroots level. And one of the things that we talk about is so important is if you see something in your city that you want more of, or if you see a politician taking a chance on a bike lane or on a new transit system, show your support, because the people who are against it are sure to show up, and the people who are for it sometimes are not as motivated. And so I think that a lot of these politicians are being fueled, the politicians who are making good change are being fueled by an electorate that is stepping up and saying what they want more, and does believe that we can have a better life and a healthier community. And they are responding to that same, I think that there's, this gradual change. And we talked earlier about progressive politicians being honest about what the situation is and saying, I'm going to address that situation. That's really resonating with people. So if you're out there and you're a voter in any community, just tell your local politicians when they're doing something good. Say thank you and support them. And if they're doing something that you don't approve of, be loud about that too. Like, we need people who care about this stuff to believe that change is possible and to put pressure on elected officials to make it so. And so that is something that I feel very strongly about. We just all need to do it. I have a new bike lane right outside my front door, and there have been a lot of haters, and I knew there were going to be a lot of haters. So I sat down one afternoon and I systematically wrote an email to every single elected official that I knew that had something to do with that, and to all the people at the Department of Transportation and to the community board, which, full disclosure, Doug serves on that community board.
I'm the man on the inside. Yeah.
But I'm just a resident in this case. And, I heard back from all of them. And I know that was, I was put in a column of these people approve. Go out and do it. Don't let them roll over you. Like, this is a place where you can actually have a lot of impact. So I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I think, like my big thing tying it back to climate action is a lot of climate action, and I consider myself a climate activist, is very, we sometimes talk about the things we're not going to be able to do or shouldn't do. Don't eat as much meat, don't fly as much. But when you add biking into your life or walking into your life or taking transit, it's such an additive thing. You save money, you get a little movement and exercise, you get connected to your community. If you're out for a walk, you bump into your neighbors, you might pass someone on a bike ride. And it's just, it's such a lovely, wonderful thing. There's a reason that trail in your neighborhood is so beloved, because it's like people want to be around other people. They want to get a little movement. And so I do think, like, from a climate perspective, a life after cars is in so many ways a better life. We know it. We do know it. It's just the getting there that is the hard part.
Absolutely. And again, the book is called Life After Cars. And to your point, Dog, like the climate fight, the war on cars, these are interrelated movements and
Absolutely.
actions. And I think what I got from this book, what I think our listeners will get from this book through your insight and your advocacy is just how you get started, how you better understand the problem. It's why I think our listeners are going to love the book. So again, I really appreciate all your work on this and that you come on the podcast to talk about it.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you for
so
having
much.
us. Yeah, we really appreciate getting the chance to talk to people like you. So it's really nice. Thanks.